Major Tom Braddock had seen too many empty promises in his time. Flags raised too high over graveyards, treaties etched on crumbling screens, and rescue missions that arrived just late enough to find only bones. But when the distress signal came through, weak, jagged, and corrupted, he didn't hesitate. Not this time. It originated from a dead sector, listed on every military map as Quarantine Red, a zone choked in silence ever since the last of the Teluan Wars. Pirates were known to drift through that part of the void, scavenging, kidnapping, selling flesh like minerals. Ships rarely returned from those corridors, but Braddock went anyway. His cruiser, the Indignant Flame, was one of the last single-pilot crafts allowed out that far without fleet accompaniment. The higher-ups didn't care. Investigate, confirm, log, and return, they'd said. The same mantra they chanted every time they needed something dealt with quietly. The derelict he found was a hollow husk of a transport ship, its name half-eaten by corrosion and fire. It hung lifeless near the orbit of a long-dead moon, tumbling slowly in the black like a ghost in search of its grave. Braddock docked manually, armored up, and stepped into air so stale it made his teeth ache. The corridors were worse than he'd expected. Torn cables swayed like vines in a breeze that didn't exist. Walls were blackened from laser fire. The deeper he went, the clearer it became. This was no accidental loss. It was a slaughter. Bodies littered the halls, some human, some not, all stripped of identity, all left to rot where they fell. But he heard something, barely audible at first, not words, breathing, ragged, shallow, desperate. He followed it down a maintenance chute into the subhold, where the stench of death grew thicker. Then a dim red light revealed her. She was curled in a cage not much larger than a storage locker, tucked behind rusted pipes and locked in with a shield grid that flickered erratically. She had no clothes, no blanket, no food. Her body was thin to the point of translucency, bones showing through pale lavender skin, her hair matted with filth and dried blood. She was a girl, barely a woman by human standards, but certainly no child. Her eyes met his. He stopped breathing. She didn't cry out or reach for him. She simply stared, unblinking, resigned. The kind of stare that comes after screaming has lost its meaning. The kind of stare that no being, no matter the species, should ever wear. Braddock knelt, reaching slowly to his belt for a signal booster and tech override. "I'm not here to hurt you," he said softly. "I'm here to take you out of this place." No answer. No reaction. He bypassed the failing shield, overriding the door system with a portable bypass rig. The lock hissed, releasing with a cough of steam and a shriek of corroded metal. Still, she didn't move. He pulled off his outer jacket and reached in carefully, draping it over her shoulders. Only then did she flinch. Her body trembled at the contact, not from pain, but from disbelief. Her arms, skeletal and shaking, slowly reached for the fabric, pulling it tighter. She still said nothing. Braddock moved slowly, gently, lifting her from the floor. She was weightless in his arms, her skin cold and damp with fever. She didn't resist, didn't cling, didn't sob. She simply lay in his arms as if she had been waiting for someone to carry her to her death, and was only surprised that death was taking so long. He didn't ask questions. He just carried her out. And as the shadows of that place fell behind them, he felt something awaken in him he had buried long ago. Something raw, instinctive, furious. Whatever had done this to her, to anyone else in those cages, was going to pay. But first, he had to save her life. The med bay of the Indignant Flame had never been used for anything more complicated than bruises and dehydration. It wasn't designed for emergency trauma, but Braddock made it work. He sealed the ship, adjusted the oxygen to match what little he could find in the Teluan bioindex, and got to work. He cleaned her wounds first, using sterilizing foam that hissed against her raw skin. She didn't wince. That frightened him more than if she had screamed. She didn't react at all, not to pain, not to touch, not to words. She was locked in herself, miles deep, behind a wall built by cruelty. He scanned her body, emaciated, dehydrated, but no broken bones. No invasive tech, no tracking implants, at least not any he could detect. Her species wasn't one he recognized, but her physiology was close enough to humanoid for basic treatment. He placed a hydration patch on her neck and another on her hip, then wrapped her in thermal layers. Hours passed. He watched her the whole time. She didn't sleep, didn't move, only stared. Then, as the ship entered slipstream toward a medical station on the edge of the Farion belt, she did something unexpected. She blinked. Slowly, deliberately, her eyes closed and reopened. Then again. Then she turned her head just slightly and looked at him. He sat at the edge of the cot, not too close. "Can you hear me?" he asked. She gave the smallest nod. "What's your name?" Silence. He waited. Then she lifted one trembling finger and pointed at herself. She touched her chest, drew a slow, curved shape in the air, and tapped it again. "Ellis," he guessed. She nodded once, weakly. He wrote it down. "Ellis, okay. You're safe now. I'm taking you to a station. You'll get real treatment there. Food, warmth, rest." Her eyes didn't leave his. Then she did something else. Slowly, with effort, she lifted her hand and touched the edge of his sleeve. Not to grab him, just to feel, to confirm. "You're real," her eyes seemed to say. He placed his hand over hers. "I'm not going anywhere," he said. For the first time since pulling her from that hell, her body began to shake. Not from cold, but from something deeper. The dam didn't break. Not yet. But the cracks had begun to show. He stayed by her side through the jump. And when she finally closed her eyes, drifting into the first sleep she'd dared in days, maybe weeks, Major Tom Braddock sat in silence, watching over her, and whispered the one promise he hadn't made in years. "You will never go back in a cage again." Ellis awoke screaming. No sound came from her throat, but the agony in her eyes and the way her limbs flailed against the medcot told the truth louder than any voice could. Braddock rushed in from the cockpit, dropping a data slate as he skidded to her side. She was thrashing. Wild, trapped, her hands clawing at an invisible cage, her knees pulled up defensively as if shielding herself from blows long since dealt. He didn't touch her. Instead, he knelt beside the cot, hands open, voice steady but low. "Ellis, you're safe. Look at me." She kept shaking her head, eyes wide with panic, sweat clinging to her forehead. It was more than just fear. It was memory dragging her under. "You're on my ship," the indignant flame. "You're not there anymore. No one's gonna hurt you." His voice softened to a whisper. "Please, come back." Her body stilled, slowly, shivers running through her as her mind fought to rise from the nightmare. Finally, her eyes found his. Her chest heaved, her arms dropped. Only then did he approach. He sat beside her and gently offered her the small tablet she'd been using to communicate. Her hand shook as she took it. She typed slowly. "They put others in cages. They screamed. Then stopped. I didn't scream, so they kept me." Braddock exhaled, pain rising through him like heat. He didn't ask why. He didn't need to. He reached for the tablet and typed a reply. He wasn't good with words, but they came as best they could. "You lived because you refused to break. That doesn't make you weak. That makes you stronger than any of us." Ellis read it. Then, to his surprise, she pressed her hand to his chest and left it there. Her eyes closed, not in sleep, but in presence. Her breathing steadied. From that moment forward, she slept only when he was near. In the days that followed, Braddock began to learn the details in fragments. Her species was called Varini, exiled from their own planet generations ago and sold between slavers and syndicates. Ellis had been taken young. She didn't remember her parents, only metal, pain, and silence. She couldn't speak. Her vocal cords had been removed in a primitive surgery, likely without anesthesia. But she was expressive in every other way. Her hands painted the air with shape and language. Her eyes could convey whole stories without a single word. Braddock upgraded her tablet and loaded it with every language database he could find. She devoured them, memorizing vocabulary faster than any human he'd seen. She began constructing complex sentences, expressing jokes, asking questions. She was brilliant. But at night, she still flinched at shadows. Braddock never left her alone. He brought her small things, a warm cloak tailored to her body, a hand-carved pendant shaped like a flame, a datapad loaded with visual art from Earth and beyond. He wasn't sure why he did it. He just did. One evening, as he was patching a hull plate near the cockpit, she walked in holding the pendant, now strung on a thin silver chain around her neck. She tapped her tablet and typed, "Why fire?" He smiled, "Because you survived everything they tried to burn you with. And now you glow." Her eyes softened, but her fingers typed again. "Why do you stay close?" Braddock hesitated. No one had asked him that in years. "I don't know," he admitted, "but I think I was waiting for something to matter again." A moment passed between them, not quite silence, not quite sound. She stepped forward and placed her forehead gently against his shoulder. The gesture was soft, intentional. She wasn't just grateful. She was beginning to trust him. And Braddock, who had spent a lifetime on the edge of war, suddenly feared something he never thought he would. He didn't want to be a soldier anymore. Not if it meant losing what he'd found in the quiet company of a girl who had survived without a voice, and still taught him how to listen. 3 weeks after her rescue, the order came. Alis was to be transferred to the Coalition's Galactic Medical Research Facility on Idranos Prime. Officially, it was for further treatment. Unofficially, Braddock knew what they were really after. Samples, scans, study. They wouldn't call it containment. They'd call it preservation, observation. But he knew a cage when he saw one, even if it was built with glass instead of metal. He stood in front of the communication display, jaw clenched as the Coalition representative explained the transport procedures. Alis, watching from across the room, couldn't hear the conversation, but she knew. She saw it in his shoulders. The way he went still, the way his voice lowered. When he finally turned off the display, she was already typing. "They want to take me," he nodded. "They think it's best, safer, more controlled." She shook her head. "It's another cage, with nicer walls." He sat down beside her, exhausted. "They'll come for you, for us. If I refuse the order," her reply was immediate, "then we don't let them come." Braddock leaned forward. "I can't run from the Coalition forever." "Then we don't run. We fight. I won't be studied. I want to live." He stared at her, and something shifted in him. He had always followed orders, always saluted the higher code, but in her eyes, he didn't see a fugitive or a refugee. He saw someone fighting to reclaim herself. He saw a reason to disobey. He took her hands. "If we do this, there's no going back." She held his gaze and signed the only thing she didn't need a tablet for. "I trust you." The following days were filled with preparation. Braddock contacted allies on neutral moons, scrubbed the Indignant Flames transponder, rerouted flight paths through deep space rifts no patrols dared travel. Alis, fierce, brilliant, and unwavering, hacked language codes, false clearance IDs, and mapped biometric pathways through systems designed to trap fugitives. They worked as one. They weren't just running. They were choosing their future. On the final night before departure, Alis handed him a small piece of fabric she had sewn by hand. It was rough, stitched with care, not skill. In the center, she'd embroidered 2 symbols. One for flame, one for freedom. Braddock took it like a man receiving a flag. Then she reached for her tablet one last time and typed, "When we are free, will you stay with me?" His reply didn't come through words. It came through action. He leaned forward, kissed her forehead, and whispered against her skin, "I never planned to leave." They left before dawn, riding a stolen signal through the stars, not just to escape, but to begin. Braddock had led soldiers through hell, negotiated ceasefires in orbiting death fields, and marched entire refugee columns out from the jaws of extinction. But nothing prepared him for the quiet weight of protecting a single woman who had never asked for war, but had lived in its teeth her entire life. With Alis by his side, survival was no longer about protocols and perimeter checks. It was about trust. Intimate, unshakable, terrifying trust. They traveled through the uncharted fringe systems, sailing the indignant flame across nebulae soaked in old radiation, past worlds no map dared claim. Every port, every station, every refueling stop brought danger. Coalition patrols grew more aggressive, and Braddock saw it in their eyes. This wasn't about jurisdiction anymore. It was about recovering what they thought was theirs. Alis remained calm through it all. She had endured cages of steel and darkness. No border checkpoint could shake her resolve now. When needed, she was the one who handled the false documentation, her hands moving across the datapad like a composer conducting silence. Braddock would watch her as she worked, jaw tight, heart torn. She had no voice, but she moved like someone who had decided never to be silent again. Their bond deepened with every escape. Sometimes, they would sit in silence for hours after a close call. Alis curled against his side, drawing stars across his forearm with her fingertip. She never signed, "Thank you." She didn't need to. Everything in her gaze said, "I would die for you now, and I almost did before you ever knew me." They found shelter on Siroth 6, a quiet moon with ice-dusted valleys and geothermal caves. A hidden outpost, long abandoned by mercenaries, served as a temporary home. For the first time in weeks, Braddock took off his sidearm when he went to sleep. That night, as wind howled outside and the frozen air cracked against the walls, Alice stood at the edge of their bunk. Braddock woke to her watching him, dressed in one of his dark undershirts, her bare feet silent on the cold floor. She typed a message and placed the pad in his hand. "I don't want to run forever. I want to become someone real, not what they made me, not what they tried to break. I want to stand beside you, not behind you. Will you let me?" He looked at her, throat tight. "You already do," he said. She reached for him slowly, with reverence and certainty, and rested her forehead against his. His arms came around her like instinct. It wasn't passion that moved between them in that moment. It was something deeper. A covenant forged not in vows or oaths, but in survival, and in the refusal to ever be alone again. In the silence between their heartbeats, Braddock understood something with terrifying clarity. He would kill for her. But more dangerously, he would live for her. And that was a far harder promise to keep. They came at dawn. Coalition interceptors pierced the pale horizon like blades, shattering the quiet of Siroth 6. The tracking beacon had been hidden well, buried inside a fuel core left behind by a supposed ally during their last refuel. Braddock had trusted too easily. He wouldn't make that mistake again. Alice had sensed them before the alarms ever sounded. She woke Braddock with her hand against his chest, her eyes already alert, her fingers spelling danger. He dressed in under 60 seconds, no hesitation, just war. They had 23 minutes before the drop troopers would land. Ellis rerouted power from the heating systems into the perimeter defense grid. She reprogrammed the entrance to lock behind them and activated the base's ancient drone sentries, barely functional, but enough to cause confusion. Braddock loaded every weapon in the locker, slung a bandolier of charges across his shoulder, and kissed her forehead. "You don't leave the tunnel until the last charge goes off. Understand?" Alice shook her head, fierce. She tapped the tablet. "We fight together." "You have no gun," he growled. She signed quickly, face burning with fury. "Then give me yours." He stared at her for a second, then slowly handed her his sidearm. Her hands didn't shake. They fought like ghosts. Braddock moved through the corridors like a shadow, eliminating teams with surgical precision. Alice stayed behind, drawing soldiers deeper into false corridors, using the control pad to slam blast doors shut and trigger ceiling collapses. Her aim, when it came to it, was lethal. She shot only once, but the soldier didn't rise again. By the time reinforcements landed, the caves were already rigged. Braddock detonated the charges from the rear tunnel while holding Alice close. The explosion roared behind them, collapsing the entire forward installation. The only entrance to their hideout was gone, buried under 10,000 tons of ice and fire. They escaped through a geothermal vent they'd mapped days earlier, emerging a mile from the ruins into the burning light of a rising Siroth sun. Braddock collapsed beside the cliff, chest heaving. Alice dropped beside him, her face smudged with soot, a cut across her cheek. She signed, "Are you mine now?" He laughed, even as blood ran down his sleeve. "I've always been." She took the bloodied glove from his hand and slipped it into her satchel, a trophy, a vow. He turned to her, breath ragged. "We're not safe yet." She typed, "No, but we're free." And for the first time, they both believed it. They descended into the lower orbits of Kovar 3, a planet wrapped in endless crimson dusk. There were no cities here, only scatterings of ancient ruins swallowed by jungle and storms. But in a narrow valley carved by time and tectonics, an enclave of exiles had built a home, non-human, non-militant, and deeply free. They didn't ask questions when the indignant flame arrived, cloaked in scars and carbon burns. They had all run from something once. Alice took to the enclave quickly. She worked in the gardens and repaired ancient filtration systems that had failed under vine and rust. She became something other than what the galaxy had taught her to be. Not a captive, not a fugitive, she became a builder. Braddock stood at a distance for a while, unsure how to exist in peace. The weight of duty never left a man like him completely, but he tried. For her. He helped train the locals in defensive tactics, improved the sensor towers, and hunted with the foragers. Slowly, his shoulders unlearned their tension. Slowly, he learned how to breathe with both lungs again. One evening, as the enclave gathered beneath the fire trees for the annual Night of Lights, when hundreds of bioluminescent creatures rose from the valley floor to spiral into the dark sky. Braddock found Alice standing alone, her white dress fluttering like smoke around her. She looked up at him, her expression unreadable. Then she reached into her sleeve and handed him a simple copper ring she had forged from old ship metal and heat-coiled wire. He stared at it, and she typed just 2 words, "Be mine?" He didn't speak. He didn't need to. He took the ring and slipped it onto his own finger. Then he removed a chain from around his neck, one he had worn since the day he became a soldier, and broke it with his bare hands. From it, he pulled the final chip from his military ID and crushed it beneath his boot. Her eyes widened, shining in the low red glow. "You're not the man I rescued," she signed. "No," he said softly. "You saved him too." The Enclave elders watched from afar. They approached only when summoned. There were no priests here, no pages to recite, only witnesses. Alice and Braddock stood beneath the spiral of lights that danced in the twilight sky and signed their vows with hands scarred by escape and courage. There were no crowds, no cameras, just the flame she had once embroidered on cloth, and the silence that had once caged her, now standing beside her in loyalty. And when the night faded into pale silver dawn, they returned to their tent, no longer fugitives, no longer guarded. They had not run, they had chosen, and they were no longer afraid. It was nearly a full cycle later when the sky cracked open. The Coalition hadn't forgotten them. Though the world they'd chosen had no digital presence, no orbital stations, and no recognizable military threat, someone, somewhere, had whispered their names again. The ship came low and hard, breaching the atmosphere without warning, scattering the Enclave's birds in 1,000 directions. No warning sirens, no threat declarations, just power. A message transmitted across the valley, sharp and clinical. Subject Alice to be retrieved for security review. Sergeant Thomas Braddock to stand down or face judicial erasure. Braddock stood at the edge of the valley, his rifle slung, his jaw set. Alice stood beside him, her cloak pulled tight, but her eyes calm. She had expected this. They both had. But they hadn't expected to feel this steady when it came. Braddock looked down at her. "We can run again," she signed. "No, not this time." He nodded slowly, then to her surprise, smiled. They stood before the Coalition emissary together as the ramp lowered and armored guards descended. The commander stepped forward, visor gleaming, voice filtered and lifeless. "Subject Alice, by the authority of Central Command, you are to be taken into immediate custody." Braddock said nothing. Alice stepped forward. She signed to the commander directly, her hands sharp with meaning. "I am not your subject. I am not your property. I have a name. I have a bond. I am sovereign." The commander hesitated. "Your bond is unrecognized under interspecies law." Braddock stepped beside her, his voice low and hard. "Then the law is about to change." The commander raised a hand. The soldiers moved to grab her. The first one didn't make it. A hidden line of archers from the Enclave fired in unison. No fatal shots, just messages. Warnings. The Coalition staggered backward in disbelief. They had expected fear, compliance. What they found was a community ready to defend one of their own. The emissary paused again. Alice stepped closer, staring into the helmet. She signed one last thing. "If you return, come not for control. Come to listen, or don't come at all." And then she walked away. Braddock followed. The soldiers didn't pursue. The emissary turned and left without a word, and the sky was whole again. That night, in the garden beneath the same fire trees that had once witnessed their vow, Alice curled into Braddock's arms. She typed a message and handed him the tablet. "You still would have killed for me." He nodded. "But I'm proud I didn't have to." She erased the words and wrote new ones. "Because you gave me a world strong enough to stand in myself." And he held her, wordless, proud, for they had not just fled the past, they had rewritten it. The days that followed the standoff were quiet, almost too quiet, like the sky itself was holding its breath. No more ships came, no threats echoed across the Enclave's comm line. But everyone felt the shift. Alice was no longer a refugee. She was something more now, living proof that survival could evolve into sovereignty. The flame she carried, once hidden under cages and silence, had become a torch for others. Refugees from the outer systems began arriving one by one, drawn by whispers of a valley where no one knelt, where names weren't erased. Braddock watched it all from the hill where they first kissed. He wasn't a leader. Not like her. She had become a symbol, a soft-spoken myth walking among the living. She spoke still with her hands and her eyes, but people followed her with reverence. Not out of fear, but because she reminded them what courage looked like after the wounds had scarred over. One night she returned from a meeting with a group of exiled scholars from Valen 3. They had brought her gifts, books, data libraries, ancient relics with her people's script etched across metal and glass. She walked into their home beneath the cliff and placed one of those relics on the table. A crown, bent, broken, and worn by time. Braddock stood, wary. She tapped her fingers lightly on the metal, then picked up her tablet and wrote, "This belonged to a queen they buried. They said I remind them of her. I told them I didn't want a crown." He stared at her, arms crossed. "You don't need one." She smiled, wrote again, "No, but I think maybe I am one, and I think you're not just my fire anymore." He sat down beside her, quiet. "What am I then?" he asked. She typed slowly, "You're the reason I lived. The war inside me didn't end when you opened the cage. It ended when you stayed after it." He reached for her hand, took it gently. "Then what do we do now?" She looked toward the windows where stars began to rise over the valley. "We build a world no one else will tear down." And so they began, not with walls or armies, but with blueprints and books and long walks where plans turned into sketches, then into structures. The enclave expanded, but never industrialized. It grew as she did, elegant, fierce, impossible to crush. Children who had been born with the word illegal stamped into their ancestry learned to read under her guidance. Elders who had never dared hope again found their place again. And Braddock? He found peace in her orbit, standing tall not because he was guarding something fragile, but because he was part of something that could not fall. One morning, he woke to find her already gone from bed. He stepped into the garden to find her planting flowers with children gathered around her knees. One of them asked her what her name meant. She didn't write the answer. She just pointed to the sky and then to her heart, and the child understood. The coalition returned, but not with soldiers. A delegation this time of envoys and counselors, their faces grim with guilt and obligation. They requested an audience not with Braddock, but with Alice. She met them alone, in the stone courtyard of the enclave, beneath a canopy of woven silk stitched with flame insignias. Braddock watched from the shadows, arms folded, every nerve tense. But he knew she didn't need his protection anymore. The lead counselor, a man who had once ordered her capture, bowed low before her. "You have become a force none of us can ignore," he said. "We ask your counsel. We ask your permission to enter these lands." Alice lifted her hands and signed 4 slow words. "Do you come listening?" The man looked up. "Yes." She typed a message and passed it to the envoy. "Then kneel. Not to me, to what you failed to see." One by one, the delegates did, not because they were forced, but because they understood. Later that night, Braddock found her on the balcony overlooking the valley. She stood with her arms folded across the rail, her face calm, her expression unreadable. "You changed everything," he said quietly. She reached for her tablet and typed a message, slowly, almost uncertainly. "Do you ever wish I had a voice?" He took the tablet from her hand, turned it off, and gently placed it on the ledge. Then he touched her jaw and whispered, "You never needed one. The stars would still follow you if they couldn't see." She turned to him, eyes shimmering. In that moment, no words passed between them, and none were needed. They stood beneath the infinite sky, 2 survivors who had forged not only each other, but a legacy. She had once been a girl in a cage, stripped of name, voice, and future. Now she was a queen without a crown, a legend with no empire, a voice that didn't need sound to shake the universe. And beside her, always, was the man who had dared to kneel, not in worship, but in belief. The fire had not just stayed, it had burned into history.